Hi, today's video is about Stowmarket Witches. Do you know the story of Stowmarket Witches? The Witches of Stowmarket. There are a few stories, or there were a few stories circulating back in the 1600s about witches in Stowmarket. They were nearly always women, although some men were tried as witches, although they were sometimes called wizards. They were often just old ladies, often widows who didn't have any means of support. And maybe, who knows, they dispensed some herbal remedies or tried to do some weird potions that would help people. Of course, back in the 1600s, there was a lot of superstition, and some of these women were tried for witchcraft. There was a woman named Wicks, who was reputed to be a witch in Stowmarket. She'd been crossing the river near the mill, and one morning her body was found in the river floating on top, and the locals said because the body was floating she was clearly a witch. There's a belief back in the day that non-witches would sink and drown and stay at the bottom, but if you're a witch your body would float. That was one of the tests of witches. So the fact that Wicks's body was found floating on top of the water, they convinced themselves she was a witch. Second story is about a woman who frequented Stowmarket, and it was said that if anyone followed her and found one of her footprints and stuck a nail into the footprint in the dust, she was unable to walk any further, and you could also do it with a knife. This story is quite strange, because isn't it usually the idea that witches were putting spells and interfering on other people's lives? So the idea that anybody could stick a nail in a footprint and stop the witch is just really weird. It just shows you how superstitious the times were. And then of course there was old Winter of Ipswich, who was a wizard, and apparently there was a farmer up at Stow Upland, and blocks of wood or planks of wood were disappearing from his barn in the night. So he called old Winter, the wizard of Ipswich, in, and they kept watch, and sure enough one of the farm labourers came over a stile and into the farmyard, helped himself to a plank of wood and set off over the stile back to his house. And in that field there was another stile that went to the farm worker's house, and so old Winter put a spell on the guy that was stealing the wood, and in the dark at midnight he couldn't find the stile out to his own house, and so he walked round and round the field all night, almost till he was exhausted. And in the end, as the farmer and old Winter watched this man, old Winter took compassion on him, went up to him, spoke to him, released the spell so he could see the stile, took the plank of wood back, and that was the end of the wood theft on the farm at Stow Upland. It's true, it's a true story, absolutely true. Absolutely no superstition involved in that story at all. And then there's the tales of Matthew Hopkins, who called himself the Witchfinder General. No one else had given him that title, but he'd read a couple of books on witchcraft, decided he would become the Witchfinder and execute witches. And he made quite a bit of money going from town to town, identifying witches and having them put to death. It was quite a lucrative business, and in the old history books of Stowmarket it says that the local council, I guess, paid him £23 for his work in identifying and putting witches on trial. So you think, oh, he's not in it for the money, but £23 back in the 1600s, at today's rate, that's £3,700. Not bad for a week's work, maybe 2 weeks tops. And so what used to happen was that he'd come to town, and in fact there's a local tax imposed on the residents of the area by the council in Ipswich to pay for the Witchfinder General. But he'd come and do some weird stuff, all sorts of weird stuff, to identify witches or alleged witches, and then he'd get them put on trial at Bury magistrates, and many of them were hanged, many of them were killed. And so what happened was, if you really didn't like someone, when the Witchfinder General came to town, you just told him that you thought that this person was a witch, and sometimes he'd do the work for you and get your enemy put to death. One example of this is that there was a vicar in a village in one place. He was a bit odd and a bit eccentric, and his congregation didn't like his preaching. They really wanted to get rid of him, but they couldn't. So when the Witchfinder came, they thought he was odd enough, so they reported him as a witch. And sure enough, the poor old man, who wasn't a witch or a wizard, was tried at Bury magistrates and put to death by hanging for being a witch. And so the church got rid of their vicar that they didn't like. That's not very Christian, not very Christian. In 1645, during the Bury witch trials of Bury St Edmunds, 18 people were hanged for witchcraft. Absolutely brutal and horrible. And what a time to be alive. I'd be absolutely terrified. You know, anyone that doesn't like you could just say you're a witch. But then a wonderful vicar took up the case of the victims. The Reverend John Gall, vicar of Great Staunton over near Huntingdon, he wrote a paper to the Houses of Parliament decrying this witchfinder and the whole idea of witch hunts. And he also began to preach a series of sermons to put people off, local people off, doing this evil thing of putting people to death. And finally Matthew Hopkins left town. In 1647 it was all over, and Matthew Hopkins died of TB, aged 27. He was buried in the churchyard at Mistley, and the church has since been destroyed, and then there was a really fancy church put up in its place, and that church has now gone. All that remains is two quite impressive towers that you can still see. I think they're owned by English Heritage, but his grave was destroyed when that fancy church was built, and there's no one knows where his grave is, so there's no monument to him, and thank goodness he's gone. And thanks for watching today. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give us a thumbs up on YouTube, and click the subscribe button and the little bell, and you'll get notifications of future videos. And I'll see you in the next video.